Right, okay, I'll hand over to Ed then in that case.
Thanks very much, Christopher. Great pleasure to be here. I'm hoping to learn very much from today. It's a good opportunity for those of us who work in the kind of practical end of cooperatives to engage with academics, engage with researchers, and have some of that, that wider setting that you described, but also some of the kind of test and challenge as well. We value the relationship that we have with the university here, with kind of Martin and colleagues as well. So we've not just come for the afternoon. We would like to keep that contact over time. It's always a bit of tension, isn't it, between those working in organisations, business life, and those working in academic life. Not that you don't have other parts to your lives as well, but in ways, universities, business schools tend to want to learn from practice for research, and we're kind of the opposite. We want to learn from research for practice. But where those work well and where you think you build those relationships, as I think in a number of other countries, the cooperative sectors have been better at doing with universities, Canada, parts of Spain and the like, you can really get that circle flowing in a really positive way, and that would certainly be my hope. I'm going to try and level a bit of the playing field in the sense of giving you an introduction to cooperatives, which is fairly general. And I'm going to focus on ownership before talking through the cooperative sector and some of the issues around democracy. We've got some, extraordinary practitioners in the room, people who work in co-ops, people who've been on the Cooperatives UK board, my boss previously, so they're going to have a chance to come in and check and challenge later on. But I want to start before I come to some slides. I think I pressed something here.
I'm sorry.
I want to start with the Venn diagram of hope, or possibly the Venn diagram of doom, depending on how you see things, because you've been running these sessions on civil society, and civil society is a kind of complex, contested sense in ways. It's good to be here because actually many sessions on civil society wouldn't extend to cooperatives, the sort of social economy in a sense. But obviously a classic way of thinking about civil society is around its relationship, a relationship between three key groups. And the one at the top would be the state and a kind of public ownership, public orientation. A second would be the classical private sector and an investor orientation, a private orientation. And then the third would be a civil society and a social orientation. And that richer concept of civil society, the Carnegie Trust inquiry led by Jeff Mulgan was open in that kind of way, looks at the circle that focuses on the social side. Now, I'm a bit embarrassed to be described as a third way proponent, because the third way went the way of the dogs some time ago. But actually, it's intriguing and important, I think, to look at the experience of the intersection between these three circles. Obviously, they're very, very simplified in the sense we've got globalization and lots of things, and devolution, which are pulling it up, pulling it down. But the kind of the Blairite and sort of late 1990s itself had continuity with what went on before in the UK. Was really looking at these intersection points here, saying that the public sector, public ownership needed essentially to be privatised. So you needed to be turning public services into agencies. That was kind of the Robin Ince report of the 1980s through to Margaret Thatcher. So-called agentification, a horrible word, I think academic came up with that one, which is you turn public services into delivery agencies and then those agencies can be taken as a unit and essentially kind of sold off. So looking at that side of it, but also looking at the side between the public sector and the state and civil society, so a quite heavy move into contracting through third sector organisations in sort of late 1990s, early 2000s, maybe up to 2007-8. Very significant increase in state contracting in terms of revenues for the voluntary sector, the classic voluntary sector, and that was seen as something that also is the kind of third of these, which is a kind of social entrepreneurial turn. The idea that actually traditional models of social organisation were slightly outdated, slightly dull, slightly backward looking, not as innovative, energetic and entrepreneurial as the kind of role models of the time, the Richard Bransons and others, and therefore there was a need to look at forms of social enterprise using business, the private sector kind of orientation with an idea of some kind of social screen or social purpose that would be there, and that kind of rumbled along until the credit crunch and came kind of crashing down. And what we've seen, of course, is a continuing and very significant shift towards privatisation, towards private contracting, a marginalisation and a reverse of that relationships with the kind of wider third sector and civil society. Compact, if anybody ever came across that, died a brutal death, sort of Julius Caesar kind of stabbed ever so many times. And the social enterprise field kind of limbers on, partly because it adds legitimacy to private sector operations, and partly because there's some interesting experiments that are there. But there is a view that actually this is entirely the wrong way to be looking at this Venn diagram. That's a Venn diagram of doom. But actually the Venn diagram of hope would be reconceiving these in other ways. And Lord Dahrendorf, Ralph Dahrendorf, LSE, great sociologist, was a liberal, and Lord Dahrendorf took a liberal view, informed by kind of mid-20th century and all that went on with statism and impacts on liberty. And his argument was that actually that turn of looking at the intersections was entirely wrong, entirely misguided, and it was a narrowing of freedom, and it was a concentration of power, be that state power or private sector power as well. And in particular, he was thinking of the civil society as a space for daily democracy, as a space for freedom, as a space for tolerance, as a space for dissent, as a space for challenge, as a space for campaigning, all of those things that are more difficult to do when you're trying to negotiate commissioning contracts for the next 18 months with some NHS provider or others. So he argued that actually you need to keep these as separate as possible. And I think there's something of a question mark here. The way that I see it is that actually the private sector is winning hands down, and bizarrely winning hands down post the credit crunch, which exposed the weaknesses of the limited liability company and investor-led kind of model. And so in a context of open borders, at least for capital, that seems to be the one thing that no one wants to challenge. We might close it for people, but surely we've got to find some way to keep borders for capital open. In that context of global challenges as well, there can be collective action problems, whether inequality or climate change or the like. What needs to happen is that those two circles that are actually oriented towards social gain, social purpose, need to be able to regulate and moderate and supplant the forms of economic organisation that are primarily focused on investor return and capital. So that's a nice sort of Venn diagram of hope, or Venn diagram of doom, or Venn diagram of hope. But in a sense, what we're going to be talking about here in terms of cooperatives is, I think, a fascination, because it's such a long-running, both social movement, one of the longest-running social movements, but also one of the longest-running experiments in different models of organisation in the economic sphere, and in particular on the exercise, sometimes limited, sometimes more extensive, of democratic models in business. I'm going to start off, just to introduce me. I was part of the team that helped start the Fair Trade Mark many, many years ago. Fair Trade Mark was criticised, Fair Trade was criticised by the new UKIP leader yesterday. He said that actually the Labour Party was spending too much, I'm sure this is your fault, Martin, spending too much time talking about dinner table issues like inequality and fair trade. And my response to that, actually, fair trade is, although it's international, it was, the first kind of fair trade kind of was a cooperative in Mexico, selling through to Max Havelaar in the Netherlands, so it's a kind of deeply cooperative exercise. But actually, it's as British as they come, because it's about the underdog and it's about fairness, and it's about cooperatives as well, which I think is British, which doesn't stop it also being Brazilian and Mexican and Spanish and French at the same time. I spent 11 years at the New Economics Foundation, which was like an amazing time of life for me. I turned up, they were thinking about closing the organisation, but one of the trustees, Jakob van Exkel, had raised some funding to bring in a director. So, I came in and hadn't got a clue what I was doing really. And then kind of over 11 years, we got engaged in a lot of alternative economic activity. And we turned out that we were a think tank, but I didn't know that at the beginning, but that's kind of where we ended up. And since 2009, it's been a privilege to work at Cooperatives UK, which is the main association for cooperatives and mutuals in the UK. Our mission is to promote, develop and unite cooperative enterprises. And we date back to a merger between ICOM, which was the worker co-op network, and the Cooperative Union, which was the network of consumer retail cooperatives. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the diversity of co-ops, because actually if you are new to co-ops, actually the co-op food stores are probably the ones that you will know, but you'll hear of a few others by the end of today. Now let's start not a Venn diagram, but just a different thing. I want to talk about ownership briefly before then moving on to cooperative and democratic models, because what is democracy? Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I hope to learn that by 5 o'clock, because it seems a really fundamental issue, because if we just think it's voting, we're going to lose out. There's some really interesting work on deliberative democracy, but I have to say I don't fully understand it. So what is democracy? What is the quality of democracy? What are we standing up for when we're thinking about democracy in the face of the kind of political shifts to the right that we are seeing? Democracy is in part rooted in control. And in an economic sphere, control is one of the key features of ownership. Marjorie Kelly said that ownership is the gravitational field around which the economy kind of revolves. So you can have nice corporate responsibility or the like, but actually if your owners don't like it, they have the right to tell you, order you, in that way of checking in your democratic rights. I was in New Lanark kind of last week on Thursday. Cotton mills, Robert Owen started there January the 1st, 1800. He set about creating the world's first workplace creche. He took children out of the factory, did other incredibly enlightened things, but actually the investor didn't like it. The investors really didn't like it, because profits were high, but of course they'd be much higher, they thought, if you could just get rid of the Institute for the Formation of Character, which is something he introduced, or the school, as well. And ultimately they did see off Robert Owen, but only after a kind of 20-year period, which became an extraordinary utopian experiment and beacon for his work. And he went on to try something which failed flat on its face. So 1 out of 2 isn't bad, but I think about around 20,000 people visited New Lanark between 1815 and 1825. So ownership, different forms of ownership, and the only reason I put this up is because it's so easy to fall into the trap of agreeing with neoliberal assumptions around economic and business life, and then trying to kind of argue through them that maybe something would be good for profit, or there's a business case for this, or the like. And of course, when we talk about property, it's so easy to talk about the market. But the market is only one institution for organising property resources, and there are others, the commons, common pool resources, all of the work that Eleanor Ostrom, co-winner of the Nobel Economic Prize, and the first woman to do so, has kind of focused on. So it's easy to think about ownership, it's about property and markets and business, but actually there's a much wider and richer notion of ownership that you will find in almost every culture and every tradition around the world, much of which has characteristics that may be resonant of cooperatives today, that cooperatives are part of a longer tradition of mutuality and democracy, without trying to kind of overclaim that. Second thing about ownership is about the psychology of ownership, which is the importance of the kind of an emotional relationship. And it's your point about checking out your democratic rights when you come into the workplace. And what we see, and there's quite a lot of academic research on particularly employee engagement, to some extent employee ownership. It's brilliant to have some research coming through on worker co-ops, because we really need you and benefit kind of from that. A lot of that focuses on areas like productivity gains, staff retention, and some very interesting data around that. I was hearing about one 28-year longitudinal study carried out by Alex Edmonds at the London Business School, which he thinks nails it in terms of causality, in terms of the relationship with the way that staff are treated and the impact on company success and the like. So that's kind of exciting. 28-year longitudinal study. It can't get much better.
What was that name?
Alex Edmonds. And actually, funny enough, he is the worker representative on the board of the London Business School as well. Research on family business, again, shows the sense of ownership matters. And the same true in the outstanding work by Virginie Perital from kind of Leeds, looking at data, and she's an econometrician, data on employee-owned businesses, and arguing that the greatest gains come from businesses that are organised with that participative democracy that you will find in the best of worker cooperatives. Now, when I was doing work on ownership, and nobody really talks about ownership, it's a funny thing. There's I'm going to bang something into something called the Inclusive Growth Commission, led by Stephanie Flanders. And you have this talk about inclusive growth, which is rather wonderful. And Theresa May is talking about some of this before she does a U-turn on things like co-workers and consumers on the boards today, in fact. But actually, it's one wonderful talk about it, then nobody talks about ownership. Even in the kind of inequalities debate, actually it's easy to focus on inequalities of income, not inequalities of assets and ownership. But of course, ownership drives those inequalities in kind of streams of income and revenue over time. So looking at ownership, I've done a little bit of work on ownership trends, asking the question as to what's happened since Lady Thatcher 30 years ago talked about a kind of property owning democracy. That was her kind of idea that she presented in Blackpool to the Conservative Party conference, that actually this idea of democracy and the economy being different, actually they could come together, because if you shared ownership more widely through shares, homes, other things like that, actually people would have a stake in society as well as a stake in the economy. So that's what she said back in October 1985. What's happened since? That was the question I was asking. Of course, I would love somebody else to have done the work. I'm quite lazy on these things, but actually, when we looked at it, we find that nobody had. It's kind of interesting. The data on ownership is very, very poor. Kind of long-run trends are very, very difficult to do. They're patchy. They ask questions in different ways. There's been some improvements to the Small Business Survey more recently, but it's in some ways it's a little disappointing. Ownership is not talked about But here are the key trends. Numbers of individual shareholders as a proportion on the London Stock Exchange has halved. Lady Thatcher wanted people to have as many share owners as car owners. Well, we still love our cars. That might be problematic for other climate change reasons. But 76% of us own a car or a van, that's adults, but only 1 in 5 are direct shareholders. Reason for that shift is the majority of listed shares are now foreign owned. So again, we have this big conversation about Brexit, sovereignty, political machineries, and yet we're not really talking about the integration of the UK within a global economic system and the movement of capital in relation to that. Stock exchanges are supposed to match up people who've got money with those people who need money for productive enterprises. And actually, in many parts of the UK, it's as if the stock exchange didn't exist, because getting hold of affordable capital in that way is just simply something that is not possible. Home ownership, this is interesting, has not increased over those 30 years, and that was the big one. And ones that people keep coming back to, George Osborne, perhaps most recently. So home ownership did increase. The right to buy was a significant boost. The 1980s policy, the right to buy was a significant boost to home ownership. What we have seen is that we've replaced public landlords with private landlords, so public rent, social rent with private rent. Some hope. I'm sometimes a little bit tired about being a point of hope in the world, but there is hope there in terms of the growth of cooperative ownership. So almost a doubling now, with the 2016 figures higher still in terms of member owners. And worldwide, what we find is that there are sometimes 3 times the number of member owners of cooperative businesses than there are direct shareholders. And that's right across the world. So more member owners of cooperatives indeed than people indirectly through pension funds and the like. And of course the numbers, financial numbers, are far, far higher for the stock markets and for listed companies. But as a means of engaging people in ownership and in business ownership, cooperatives are an extraordinary force for dispersion of ownership. And for democratic spread, economic democratic spread. Also on the rise, individual entrepreneurship, owner managership, and this is a wide range, and there are many different groups and segments within this category. They go from 0 hours, precariat, through to software engineers, kind of running their own consultancy business. The numbers are on the up. It's not what economics says should happen. Development economics says that you over time move from an informal economy towards a more formal economy, and we're doing the reverse. And the issues around the gig economy, workers' rights and the like, are a key issue and one we are looking at. Put all of those together, and I think particularly just to add the point on this is that notion of the precariat, as Guy Standing calls it, is particularly apt because if you take private rent and self-employment together, and I don't think this is recognised enough, that's an extraordinarily uncertain place to be, because you have predictable, certain outgoings in terms of your rental income and uncertain income, patchy income, often feast to famine. If you're running your own business, and therefore if things go wrong, you could be out of a home, and that's precarious living. I'd love to hear from you later about some of the connections and the link with AltGen and the work there about how younger people are seeing this and responding to these kinds of threats as well as opportunities. Overall, we put those in a graph, and what we find is that there has, and the purple line here is an overall index of economic ownership over the last 30 years, is that there's been a significant narrowing and decline in terms of economic ownership. And what's interesting to me politically, and I won't dwell on politics, I like to make throwaway remarks about politics, but is that no political party has really seized the issue of ownership, has made the ownership agenda theirs, has consistently worked on ownership in all of its sense. You can defend the public sector in terms of public ownership, or you can stand up for kind of co-ops and social ownership, but actually ownership more widely. But there are countries that have done some of this. Japan is an interesting case, where there's been a doubling of share ownership over the last 30 years. And while Japan wouldn't be a model for everything, actually it shows what a consistent framework can do in terms of a policy framework that sees a goal of spreading economic democracy, at least in terms of wider ownership. Along that we have, now Jesse Norman is a minister in the Department for Business, Enterprise and Industrial Strategy now. This point about the extent to which ownership as well doesn't really work for listed companies. The kind of ownerless corporation is the idea that actually that the model is not providing long-term ownership. It's a cashing out model. Whereas in co-ops, ownership is something slightly different. You don't get the kind of upside of the ownership because capital typically remains at the same par value. It's sort of cashing, it's a commitment in rather than cashing out. And that's reflected in survey work we did last year, which I think has, been pretty much the mood of 2016, is about a lack of control in terms of business, lack of control in terms of the workplace. 58% of people believe they have no voice, no influence in the workplace. So let me tell you a little bit now about cooperatives. It's great to do through some examples. This is FC United of Manchester, when Manchester United was taken over by the Glaziers, using tax-leveraged corporate debt to do it. They used Manchester United's money essentially to buy the company by leveraging it with debt on which it then paid significantly lower tax because profits were significantly down. So you funded the takeover of Manchester United by the Glaziers, even if you're a City fan. And FC United thought they'd had enough and set about creating a football club as they thought football ought to be run. And it hasn't been an easy ride, and some of the cultural issues haven't gone away, but they have raised funds for an amazing kind of community-owned ground in Newton Heath. They were the first football club to pay the living wage, so they were there before Chelsea, current leaders, and others in that regard. Delta T services, and Debbie on the right says, I can't see myself working anywhere where I couldn't be part of the decision-making process. An example of a technology worker cooperative operating outside of Cambridge. Music teacher co-ops. This is a really interesting example where we've been working on the gig economy, working with trade unions to organise workers around cooperative models of action. And here we've been working with the musicians' union. So music teachers used to work directly for schools, they'd be employed by schools, but that model doesn't work for Serco and the like. So what you do is you aggregate contracts across a large number of schools and you push teachers off the payroll. Those teachers can then very efficiently be employed by Serco or somebody else, who can then rip off the taxpayer over time after having put in a bargain bid for the initial contract. I think that summarises the procurement process. So the Musicians Union has been organising music teachers to respond to this. Examples, Newcastle was one of the first, Swindon's a really good example as well. And the music co-op essentially does the marketing, so it does the commissioning, the negotiation with the education authorities and others. It does some of the marketing for the teachers as well, but they remain freelancers. This is a freelancer co-op. And there are some astonishing examples of freelancer co-ops around the world. The Self-Employed Women's Association in India, I think, is one of the most inspiring. But we published a report on that earlier in the year called Not Alone. And we have been working in partnership with TUC and the Cooperative College to develop an organiser's handbook for freelancer co-ops. We've seen a rise in community co-ops as well. How are we doing on timing? So 7, 8 minutes?
Absolutely, it's fine.
And this is about, in partly again, response to austerity, but communities organising to save assets locally that they care about. Stephen Fry here was backing a cooperative buyout of a pub, the King's Arms in Sholdham. That's about 250 years old. It's a brutal market, pubs, because of cheap booze elsewhere and everything that's been going on. So pubs are closing. One pub closes every 3 hours. Not the same pub, but it is a brutal market. In some areas, the community can list that, but also they can try and take it over and run it on a community-owned cooperative basis. And the point here is, in business terms, is that margins are so tight. Let's say we're a village, and our shop is in the village, but Tesco's is out of town, or you've got online kind of shopping that you can turn to. It's not that we all decide we're not going to shop at the village shop. It's just that a few of us, kind of Ian, Tanya, maybe, of all of us, to say, okay, well, we're going to get our shopping elsewhere, online delivery or out of town. Margins are so tight, that will kill the village shop. So you have, whatever the kind of political dilemmas are in democracy, tyrannies of this, that and the other, there's a tyranny here of Ian and Tanya in a sense, because they remove the village shop because it can't operate. If you run that shop, take it over and run it cooperatively, which is that the Plunkett Foundation has been supporting, as an awards event yesterday for some of the most remarkable examples, actually we buy back in. You're going to come back in? Yeah. They're going to come back in and so you buy in that loyalty because people are involved directly in the enterprise. So, cooperatives can be in high technology, highly profitable kind of areas of business, but they can also be in these areas where you could only make it work on a cooperative basis. Cooperatives are a distinct model of business. Doesn't mean to say we're always more successful, but as a distinctive model of business, there can be distinctive areas where the model can have competitive advantages. We've set up a platform for equity crowdfunding for cooperatives. We're pioneers of the peer-to-peer crowdfunding space in the UK, and in fact cooperatives, the more cooperative share issues than there are IPOs on the alternative investment market. Again, such has been the scale. And we've solved some of those issues, thank you to Ian for kind of work over a long period of time on some of the legal models and capital models for societies, which is one of the main legal models co-ops you can use. You can use any legal model, but societies, the capital model, means that we have solved some of those issues of exit in terms of equity crowdfunding that actually mainstream business still has not. So examples of those community co-ops, here's solar PV. I think this is on the roof, I may have this wrong, on the roof of Harvey's in Lewes, in Sussex. Lewes is one of those kind of, slightly hippie, slightly co-op towns, like Leicester. Harvey's is the local beer. So to have local beer that's actually powered by locally generated energy, owned by local people cooperatively, makes that rather special. So across the UK, there are around 7,000 cooperatives now, turnover of close to 34 billion. Bit of an hourglass in this model, so some very large cooperatives that have been around for quite a long time, a smaller middle, and then a very wide number of smaller scale community co-ops and worker co-ops as well. In terms of the economy, right across the economy, so retail, housing co-ops, mutual housing, farmer co-ops, Arla for example, Lurpak, your own cooperative butter, health and social care, where I started looking forward, your creative sector, creative sector as well. There we go, creative industries, sports and leisure, energy, environment, education as well. And education is one of those areas that's quite an interesting, quite a complicated story. At one level of the growth of cooperative schools as a democratic governance model for schools, still within the state system and a values-based model, but also a kind of complicated story as well. There are 7 cooperative principles which talk to both the structure of cooperatives and also the culture. There's a set of values as well, and in a survey that we did for a book which I published, The Values, thank you Martin, I'll show it in a minute. Social responsibility came out first, democracy was second, so democracy is a core value of cooperatives for the 1.6 kind of million cooperatives around the world, and of course they're incredibly varied. You know, the saying is, if you've seen one co-op, you've seen one co-op. Fair trade mark, an example of innovating out of values. A number of cooperatives came together to develop the fair tax kind of mark. Cooperatives overall, the top 5 co-ops pay far more tax than Starbucks, Amazon, eBay, Apple, Facebook, and all combined. Suma, I put down as a case study, but that was before I saw the programme and that you were on, Bob. But I will put, you'll recognise the face there. But a really interesting example of a business, and I do use Suma as a case study in my short book on values. I mentioned that just now.
It's just there, and if you want to wave it, just wave it.
There we go. So that's the advert.
Should we pass it around?
It's a business based.
Afterwards.
It's a business based on the values of equality, and so a lot of very interesting work around, for example, gender equality at the moment points to the extent to which tackling equality can't be limited to tackling things at the conscious, cognitive level, because actually inequalities and discrimination and prejudice and belief and attitudes is formed at the unconscious level, and bias plays out in forms of unconscious inequality, and therefore you have to act at that level as well. I think this is a rather nice example of taking that on board in a very, very deep way. I won't talk to this model, but kind of it comes up, but something of how do you match values, the culture of cooperatives and democracy onto structures, particularly where you have mixed ownership. We're seeing a growth in multi-stakeholder cooperatives, which are kind of 360-degree cooperative because you give ownership to all of the different stakeholders involved. But doing so can be more complicated as well, and the cultural side is absolutely key to that shared values. We do publish a code of governance for worker cooperatives, and kind of Bob, again, you fed in to this. It's been translated into many other languages, Japanese, Korean, Finnish. And it's well worth a look if you're interested in the practicalities of democratic organising. And it looks at different models of organisation, the collective, self-managing kind of work teams, in contrast to some extent with hierarchical models. That there is a variety that is out there in terms of models that are out there as well. Online, of course, and I'll just kind of come to a close in and around this, we're seeing a growth of collaborative models, but also a colonisation of that space by venture capital, kind of close to Silicon Valley. So there is a sharing economy, but no shared ownership. And this is a key area where work and thinking is going on around what would it look like to have platform cooperatives that actually could compete in part by offering shared ownership. There's one campaign to turn Twitter into a platform co-op. That's going to be a big fundraising kind of ask, but a lot of interest in that. More widely, organisations and democracy in the face of sustainability. I put this cartoon in because I rather like that idea, and it rather summarises a bit of what we're doing in the cooperative sector, because we are working on democratic models of business. There's a lot of challenge in and around those, but we think the world needs it. But even if we're wrong, actually, we're going to have a better time engaging in that. And another way of saying the same thing is Lily Tomlin's kind of phrase, which is rather nice, which is the trouble with the rat race is that even if you win, you are still a kind of rat. There's big issues. I hope I haven't. I mean, I've glossed over to some extent the cooperative story. I want to be open about some of the weaknesses and challenges that are there. Not all co-ops succeed. We had issues with the cooperative bank, which talked to issues around, I think, what academics call isomorphism, which is the extent to which you try to copy others that are bigger and around you, what the market looks like, even if you are distinctive and different, and those pressures are significant. That's the closing thoughts of the worker co-op code of governance. And an excellent book, if you're interested in some of the theories and ideas about worker self-management or worker cooperation, is this book by Paul Bernstein called Worker Democratization and its Internal Dynamics. And maybe if it's all right, I'll just close on the 6 characteristics that Paul picks out of workplace democracy as the interlocking components that you need in order to sustain workplace cooperation over time, workplace democracy. First is participation in decision making. The second is an economic return to participants based on the surplus that they produce. The third is sharing information, management level information with employees, with workers. The fourth is guaranteed individual rights, so there's a balance between the individual and the collective. The fifth is an independent appeals system. I was interested in that, kind of quite where that fits as well, but so it is a learning system. And the sixth is then a participatory and democratic awareness and culture too.
Okay. Right, so we've got, so Alan Martin Parker, for those who don't know me, I work here and doing stuff on alternative.